Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, welcome to our subjects, business ethics. This subject is actually one of the main subjects in business where you have to be aware of different ethical principles. The code of the subject is as clear on this screen, BIDS 16. You have different concepts and cases, inshallah, will be discussed during these sessions in terms of scenarios, in terms of business context and sets where ethical issues and ethical demand is actually very important. So in terms of the textbook that you may use during this session is Pearson International Edition, 6 Business Ethics Concepts and Cases. Now first we need to understand the outcome of this subject. The principles beyond taking this subject is actually very important. After completing this course, students would be able to explain and understand the theoretical foundation of the business ethics. This is actually very important because we need to discuss different cases as companies may have to take decisions regarding their business issues. They may follow mistakes regarding these decisions, talking about the ethical background of these decisions. So that is why we need to understand the theories and the foundations of these ethics. And we will mainly talk about 3 main principles of ethics. So students should be able to recognize and resolve ethical issues in business. Actually, this is one of the most important objectives of this course. Once understanding the principles of ethics, students should be able to discuss these different business issues. So we may refer to cases where companies have to develop maybe products, new policies, strategies, and sometimes even regulations within the company, the boundary of the business itself. So discussion of the business in terms of the potential interest of the company and of course of ethical background of these decisions, ethical consequences to the stakeholders, not only to the decision maker. The third objective of this course is to reflect and examine the importance of the ethical dimension in business and the workplace decision making process, and of course to confidently apply systematic ethical reasoning to business dilemmas. In fact, we are living in a dynamic market. Businesses actually have to work in a changeable environment. And accordingly, we don't have like a fixed set of rules. Companies may have to come up with different rules, different decision process, different models of work itself. So that is why we cannot actually apply the same systematic approach. In that sense, sometimes companies have to justify the reason why they take certain decisions to fit given circumstances. And accordingly, we have also to discuss these decisions based on ethical perspective. So based on that, we will cover the following content. So the following points regarding this subject will be as follows. The first point will be ethics, businesses, and basic principles, in which here we will talk about the definition of the word ethics as a principle, and then we will talk about business ethics in general. The second topic is about ethics in international businesses. Now, talking about controversial issues and policies made by companies can also be a different way as talking about international businesses. These companies may have to operate in different cultural set, different values, and accordingly have to stick to different mechanism, methodologies in taking decisions. That is why sometimes these companies may fall in these ethical dilemmas, and that is why we need to talk about this issue. The third topic is about the basic ethical principles. We said before, in order to come up with the right outcome of this subject, we need to understand these principles. So that is why the first part of this textbook, this subject, is the theoretical foundation. In this chapter, we will talk about the first principle, that is utilitarianism. The chapter that follows is about the second and the third principle of ethics, that is right and justice. And then we will talk about the different type of markets that companies may have to operate. Ethics and the environment is another issue where we have to discuss different environmental issues that pop up to the surface in nowadays business. Another topic is about the ethics of consumer production and marketing, sustainable marketing and ethics. This is in fact one of the sources of these ethical dilemmas, where we have to deal directly with customers, either in terms of a direct communication with customer in the service industry, or in terms of products given to employees. We have to balance out between the interest of the company and that of the customer. Not to forget the environmental issues, as we discussed this in the chapter before. The other topics will be about job discrimination within the boundary of the business, the rational organization, workplace conflict, and ethics. It's also very important to know, dear students, that this course session will be conducted in different means, and that you have to use the LMS, Learning Management System. All sessions are actually adhered to the LMS, and that students can get all these materials by joining the program. Assignments will also be attached to every single session, where students have to apply the theories, knowledge, and practices he or she gets in dealing with different questions. Cases and important topics are presented in forums, inshallah, for further discussions among students and with the facilitator. And we said before, this is not just about not similar to other disciplinaries. This is subject to the kind of changes in the market. So for some companies, what might sound as a good decision may not be so for other companies, depending on the nature of that company, the nature of business, the environment where the company actually operates. So what can be good for one company may not be so for another company. And that is why such kind of discussion among students can also help in establishing a good and solid background. Now we start with our first session, that is ethics, businesses, and basic principles. Inshallah, during today's session, we have the following outcome, where students should be able to first explain the meaning of business ethics and its issues. This is one of the fundamental issues. We need to understand the word ethics in general, according to the comprehension of every single individual. However, you as a business student, inshallah, hopefully to handle business issues like a manager, need to understand business ethics in general, and of course the issues that accompany this term. Discuss the meaning of these issues in terms of ethical dilemmas, ethical consequences of these issues. When we talk about business here, the word issue may represent a problem that a company have to deal with. And this kind of problem can be dealt with using the ordinary management methodology. However, the question is whether such kind of solution that the company comes up with was ethical or not. So that is why we need to discuss these ethical issues. We need to discuss the application of the ethics to corporate organizations and evaluate arguments for and against business ethics. So we have different points of view. If you're talking about managers, if you're talking about customers, consumers, employees, the environment, the community, that is why there will be different points of view that needs to be discussed. In that sense, we have the following contents. The first one is the definition of ethics. Ethics and morality, there is like a difference between both terms, but they sound the same. However, in terms of the application, they can be different. So business ethics, now once we understand the meaning of ethics in general, and that we can differentiate between ethics and morality, we need now to understand the meaning of ethics in a business context. And we will also talk about the globalization and multinational and business ethics. And finally, we end up with the moral development and moral reasoning. Now, we have been bombarded with a lot of talk about ethics. But actually, when we talk about business ethics, we need to understand what we mean exactly by the word ethics. So before we talk about the principles of ethics that we will use in addressing business issues, there a special kind of terms we always hear that can affiliate with different professions. For example, if you talk about accounting ethics, so here we refer to the code that guides the professional conduct of accountants. So this kind of ethics relates only to accounting professional. We also have different kind of ethics as to talk about professions. For example, what kind of ethics do we have regarding lecturing? So this is the kind of means of conducting the sessions with the students, for example, transparency with students, developing strategies and channel of communication with students, etc. Medical ethics is another example here, which are the kind of ethics as to conduct in this profession. For example, maintaining and saving secrets of patients. But as we talk about ethical issues in business here, things will be different. So before we discuss the ethics and the ethical principles, we need to know what we mean by the word ethic. So, as talking about ethics, an ethical issue is something that is right. So we say ethical is what is actually right. It means accepted standards in terms of personal and social welfare. And as we say about what is right, it is actually what is accepted by individuals and accordingly by the whole society. So ethics, on the other hand, will be the principles of conduct that control and govern the individual or a group. However, can we say ethics is exactly the same in terms of meaning to morality? There's actually a difference here. Although ethics deals with morality, it is not quite the same as morality. How is that possible? Ethics is actually the kind of investigating that you do regarding business issue. So when we talk about ethics, we talk about you trying to figure out whether something is right or wrong. Now this thing can be a decision, it can be a policy, regulations, or the way that the company operates. So the activity of investigating and the results. So here this is what we mean by ethics. On the other hand, morality is the subject matter that ethics investigates. For example, if we talk about honesty, so honesty here is the subject matter. So when we talk about this morality in a company, we need to know whether the company here is honest in terms of dealing with customer. So there is a problem and that we want to investigate whether this company is honest in terms of providing information about the products, for example, to customer. Now doing that is what we refer by ethics. But actually the topic we are addressing is morality, the subject matter. And that is what we call morality. Now ethics and morality here, honesty and transparency are actually examples of subject matters which we may investigate whether they exist or not. So these subject matters are actually can be applied in a different way from one business to another. So we will not address these things in the same way in different businesses because they're actually different. So doing such kind of investigating procedures of companies is what we refer to ethics. But the subject matter itself is what we called morality. So honesty, transparency in business are examples of morality. So if we want to see whether these principles, whether these concepts are applied by company, then we talk about ethics. So subject matter which we may need to see if they exist in that business. So doing so is what is referred to as ethical issue, is that business is regarding honesty and transparency. Now ethics in our lives. Ethics are the discipline that, of course, examine one's moral standards in our life. So we said before, Ethics is actually what is accepted by individuals and the society. Besides, it examines moral standards of the whole society. So it's about individuals and it's about society. So it asks how these standards that can be accepted by individuals and society are actually applied to our lives, and whether these standards are reasonable or unreasonable. That is why it's a matter of investigating these standards. So we are talking about ethics. So the study of ethics can be a normative study. A normative study means what things are good or bad, or what should be, and what actions are right or wrong. So this is what we mean by normative studies. So you study an ethical issue or an issue that is applied by either individuals in an organization, like for example managers, or the organization itself, or a body of companies in a given economy. So you need to know whether what is done is actually good or right. So you study and you come up with a conclusion. This is a normative study. On the other hand, descriptive study, no conclusions as to be right or wrong. You only study what happens in the society. You describe what happens only. So it's just a matter of describing the real world as it is. So this is actually the difference between normative and descriptive. Normative is that you study the current situation and you try to come up with a conclusion to what happens, whether it is right or wrong. While descriptive study is you only study and figure out what happened, what currently is happening, without coming with a conclusion. Now, business ethics. So far we talked about what ethic or what an ethical issue is, whether it is right or wrong, and then the difference between ethics and morality. And we see how ethic is applied in our lives. It's about the accepted standards by individuals and by the society as well. Now, we need to know what business ethics actually stand for. Our main discussions will be about ethical issues, of course, in the business arena. So here, business ethics as a definition, a specialized study of moral standards as they apply to business institutions, organizations, and of course, behavior. So what are the kinds of ethical issues in that regard? We have the individuals within a company and their behaviors and decisions. Now, these individuals can be sometimes in top management positions. For example, managers can also be individuals like employees, can also be the front desk employees dealing with customers. So at the end, in disregard of the position of that individuals, we will discuss any kind of behavior and decisions made by individuals and institutions. Besides, we will talk about the whole business, the whole corporate. So an individual company taken as whole. So ethical issue here can be, for example, the product that they produce, how they deal with the environment, information given to customer, promotion, etc. Finally, we will study ethical issues as the whole systemic. The whole system here, including the social systems within which business operate. Now, examples of these ethical points relevant to individuals, corporate, and the whole system will be as follows. The systemic issues here, questions raised about the economic, political, legal, or other social systems where businesses operate, within which these businesses or corporates may operate. For example, questions about the morality of capitalism. Capitalism would be different from other kind of system adopted by the whole society. So we may have command system, we have open system. So that is why we have capitalism, in which a lot of businesses nowadays actually operate. So questions about whether capitalism is good to maintain ethical principles will be discussed and addressed here. The laws governing conduct by companies and individuals. Regulations. So in terms of regulations, we discuss different issues regarding the regulations set by companies and by the whole system, and whether these regulations are morally right or not. So these are the things we would discuss, inshallah, as we talk about business ethical issues. Beside the industrial structures, the kind of relation between the company and the employees and the government. So this kind of relation, whether it's accepted morally or not, whether there's some kind of manipulation, and a special kind of lobbying, special interest, and the like. And finally, social practices. So as we discuss the ethical issues, we will address these dimensions: the capitalism, laws, regulations, the structure of industry, and finally social practices. Regarding the corporate issues, we started quite comprehensive. Now we talk about companies. What kind of business issues that we may discuss as we talk about companies? Here are some examples. The activities of companies. Activities of companies can be very different, varying from producing product, promoting the product itself, packaging, setting the price, etc. Policies made by the companies can be also subject to different ethical issues, and sometimes can result in an ethical dilemma regarding the number of hours employees should work, condition, salaries, wages, etc. Practice by the companies and the organizational structure. On the individual level, we have questions about practical individual within organization, and of course their behaviors and decisions. Now the point here, sometimes individuals in these companies may affect the whole system. So we may refer to top management here. So the decisions made by those individuals can affect the whole company. And accordingly, the practices by the company will also be affected and can also affect customers and the society outside. So that is why we also need to address the individual issues regarding ethics. So here, these include questions about the morality of the decisions, actions, or sometimes the character of that individual. Now we talk about globalization, multinational, and business ethics. What is globalization? Now, globalization is one of the terms that we always address in different business issues, regarding different business issues. Globalization is the worldwide process by which the economic and social system of nations have become connected. So this is what we mean by globalization. And if this is so we talk about products, services, information, know-how, values, moving freely from one place to another. So significant economic benefits enable nations to specialize in producing and exporting those goods and services. So sometimes as we talk about business opportunity, we talk about this kind of open system that companies or enable companies to produce products and sell them overseas. Besides, the development of today's technology enables companies to compete other businesses in different geographic areas. So what issues do we have as we talk about globalization? Now, we will discuss some of the issues affiliating with ethics here. For example, multinational and business ethics. When we talk about globalization, we talk about big companies that operate in different countries. One of these companies, for example, is, let us say, Siemens. Siemens is a huge business establishment that operates in almost more than, say, 50 countries, having more than 150,000 employees around the world. So, such huge establishment may have ethical issues here and there. Now here, many poor nations in Africa and the former Soviet Union have been left behind. So we're talking about those big companies utilizing fortunes in these poor countries. So they have only cheap primary commodities to trade. So we're talking about big businesses utilizing these countries, generating huge profit from these poor countries. So this is one of the elements that we would discuss as to globalization. Another issue here, the World Bank reports as globalization has spread, inequality also has increased, both between nations and within nations. Now, this might be the result of the free markets. Free markets enable companies to operate in different geographic areas. So a lot of companies nowadays can join businesses, can enter markets, and utilize opportunities in these markets as to the demands. However, less consideration is given to the nations in these countries. Now, multinational corporation, as a definition, is a company that maintains manufacturing, marketing, service, or administrative operations in many different host countries. As I said before, Toyota cars, Sony Corporation, Siemens, these are all examples of multinational corporation. General Electric is another example of those huge business establishment founded by Thomas Edison, has operations in more than 100 countries around the world. This is a good business as we talk about business, but when we address ethics here, we may figure out that there are some ethical issues in the way these companies actually operate their activities. Now, what issues we may have regarding this topic? Multinationals have moved their operations out to different countries with its tough environment. We're talking about these poor countries. So we have tough environment, labor, tax laws, and established operations in southern China, for example. So here, environmental standards are low, labor rights are poorly enforced, and tax breaks are common. Now, in these countries, companies can generate high profit, and they can utilize these issues to their own interest, which is an ethical issue here. Another issue, of course, is transferring technologies and products into developing nations. So we're talking about poor countries that are not ready to adopt them. So we have toxics, insecticides, and farm works face injuries. Now, the policies by these countries are not very solid, so companies utilize this poor system to their own interest. Now, questions here. What are their obligations to displaced workers in their home countries? Other questions can be, do multinationals have an obligation to try to improve the labor? Of course, this point can be a matter of discussion. We may talk about the whole system adopted by the government. The governments in these places are usually poor, and they try to collect some money. So they may let go of discussions about obligation of companies developing and improving the labor, as long as they collect this money. So that is why some companies may utilize this poor infrastructure of policies to their own interest without paying attention to the labor and the worker. So the wage standards will be very low, okay? And that will be good enough for companies to address or to head for such countries. Do they have any obligation to refrain from exploiting workers in other countries? For example, they can take advantage of poor worker. So an employee in India, for example, or China may receive only $5 the whole day, while other workers in other countries can be paid more than $50, sometimes $100 in other countries. So that is why companies and huge business establishments actually move to places like these countries where the $5 will be accepted by those employees. So ethically, this can be exploiting workers. So utilizing the poor and the low living standards in these countries, and that they know that these employees will accept this very low payment. Now, business ethics and culture. We have something referred to as ethical relativism. Here, this is a theory that there are no ethical standards that are absolutely true. So this is a matter of a given circumstances, and that apply or should be applied to companies and people of all societies. So what can be right in this society may not be so in another society. So that is why we talk about relativism. It can be related to the system in that country. So what is accepted in this place may not be really accepted in another country. So the $5 day wage that is given to employees in China would not be accepted by employees in America, for example. So more development and moral reasoning. For some people here object to the entire notion that ethical standards should be brought into business organization. And of course, they have their own justifications as follow. They say the pursuit of profit and perfectly competitive free market will by itself ensure that the members of society are served in the most socially beneficial way. So those people believe that we have to give a free or complete freedom to companies to pursue their interests in these markets. So these markets will enable different individuals and different companies to participate. So the more companies, the more options, the more the prices will drop. So in that sense, companies, individuals, and also customers will all benefit. Another justification is that they claim that employees as loyal agents are obligated to serve the companies single-mindedly, and whatever ways will advance the employer's self-interest. Doing so, of course, will pay back. Okay, so will pay off for employees and, of course, for the company itself. So doing so will mean here an increase in sales, for example, productivity, and profit, and that should also pay those employees back in terms of increase in salaries, promotions, training, and development. The third justification regarding those people, they say that obeying the law is sufficient for business, and that business ethic is essentially nothing more than obeying the law. These issues actually are by people who believe that we should not interfere into business regarding ethics. So we should not apply ethical standards as we talk about business issues. But of course, this point of view may be right sometimes, some other times may not be necessarily right. So by this, dear students, we come to the end of our first session in which we discuss the following. We define the meaning of business ethics and its issues. We discussed several business ethical issues. We also discussed the application of ethics to corporate organization, and we evaluated various arguments for and against business ethics. So regarding the first session, you will have the first assignment attached to the session. So you're supposed to answer the questions in this assignment according to the time, duration, and the deadline set. Thank you very much for listening. Wish you all the best and see you inshallah next session. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Dear students, welcome back to our sessions with the subject business ethics. Today we'll take the second topic regarding this subject, and we will talk about the ethics in international business. So the following outcomes will be covered inshallah during today's session. So after studying this chapter, you should be able to discuss different ethical issues in international business. Explain what we mean by M&C, multinational corporate, power and moral decisions. Discuss the multinational corporate and social responsibility. Evaluate possible determinants of ethical behavior. Discuss how managers make ethical decisions in multinational corporate. So regarding these outcomes, we have the following contents. First, ethical issues in international business, multinational corporate power and more decisions, social responsibility, determinants of ethical behavior, and finally, ethical decision making. Now, as we talk about business ethics, we may not only talk about business activities by individual companies inside countries. So we may refer to multinational corporations that operate in foreign host countries. So where the laws, decrees of government, common practice, or level of development are sometimes much different from those of their home countries. And accordingly, the decisions by these big companies may not fit ethically with these elements. So the local status quo cannot simply be adopted without questions by multinational managers, but must still be subjected to ethical analysis. For example, one of these issues here is the wages and salary by these companies, whether these salaries and the compensation system in general fit the laws, fit the government decrees and the common practices adopted by these countries. Now, what are the ethical issues in international businesses? Now, when we talk about ethical issues for companies that operate internationally, so we may talk about managers making decisions that must be consistent with different national environments. So, for example, the political systems where these companies actually operate, legal systems, culture, and the economic development levels. So, a company like Total extracting out oil, gases in regions or countries like Arab countries must deal with these points. Political system, the legal system, the culture of people or the culture of the country where these companies actually operate, besides the economic development levels, and based on which decisions as to compensations, number of working hours, promotion should also be relevant. So what is ethical and normal in one environment may not be so in another. So countries can be different in terms of their culture, values, and legal systems. So the company cannot adopt the same system in one country and apply it to other countries. And accordingly, that is why we say ethical issues sometimes may arise from such kind of problem. A legal system of country that is quite good enough for company may not be necessarily so for another country. So ethical issues in international businesses are as follow. They arise most often by the context of employment practices. So the employment practices adopted by companies can be very different from one place to another. Now the problem is when a multi or international business adopts the same employment practices in different countries. So this is one of the issues that may create an ethical dilemma or ethical problem. Human rights is another issue. So for example, an employee who works for 12 hours and that not given an appropriate compensation or wages may result in an ethical dilemma. Environmental policies, corruption, and the company's perceived moral obligations to society. Now, this is an example of a decision that should be made by the top management of that company. What kind of obligation do we have to the society where our company actually operates? So the company is utilizing the fortune of this country, for example, fishing, oil, producing, selling products, but what services do we provide to the society? What community services such companies are supposed to offer? Now, this is something that should be accepted and perceived by the top management of these companies. Now, examples of these employment practices, what standards should be applied? For example, do we have to apply the standards of the home nations? For example, if you're talking about Siemens is a company that is headquartered in Germany. So if this company operates in China, do they have to apply the practices in Germany or in China? So this is what we mean by home nations. Do they have to use the host nations? Actually, most of the companies adopt the host nations' practices because they're usually easier, cheaper, simple, and sometimes they deal with the economic level of these countries. So if I adopt the home nation, the company may pay twice or 3 times more than it should pay in the host nation. So that is why companies sometimes adopt more practices regarding the host nation. Some other times, big companies may adopt other kind of system. So for example, a company like Microsoft, let us say, or Sony Corporation or Toyota may adopt the system of a third company, a third country. So Toyota is a Japanese company that operates in France, let us say, in France. So they may adopt the system of this country. So we have employees from Japan, and those people operate in France. They have the system of the country adopted by France. They can also adopt system by German managers, by let us say American employees, American managers. So the system that fit with the country, with the company itself, in disregards of the country where it operates. So this is what we mean by other. So for the employment practices regarding how much salary should be given, the number of hours, the system of training, development, appraising, etc., they can adopt the policies by the home nations or where the company comes from, or the practices adopted by the country where the company works in, or any practices that fit with the circumstances, whether home or host. Now, should the multinational corporate adopt its policies, or should they standardize? Now, this can also be another question. Most of the companies adopt the kind of strategies and standards that fit with the current circumstances. And that is why sometimes we have some kind of ethical issues. So, example of these practices if we talk about employment practices, hiring practices, how do we get employees? Labor relations, diversity issues, number of employees from different places with different backgrounds, and employment conditions. So these are examples of issues that require careful thought, without such kind of careful thought, this can result in ethical dilemmas or ethical problems. Now, what are these problems that companies may face ethically, not legally? Sometimes companies may have an opportunity to generate profits by working in countries where we have repressive regimes. So here, is it ethical for multinational corporates to operate in countries with repressive regimes? Now, what we mean by repressive regime is a dictator kind of system controlling the country. So, regarding business opportunities, companies may not really think of the regimes as long as they generate profit. Now, this is an example of ethical issues that should be addressed to company. But here, we have some questions as to the investment and the opportunity seized by companies in these countries. For example, is inward investment an agent for change? So, for example, a company that moves from Germany to, let us say, another country where the regime is not democratic, where we have a repressive regime oppressing, for example, minorities. Okay? So, is inward investment an agent for change? For example, in Germany, we have a lot of business opportunity. The level of economy is good enough for these countries, for these companies to invest. Now, should these businesses move to these regimes? This is one of the questions. Another question, what if competitors from other nations invest and you don't? For example, a company may think that they would not invest in, let us say, North Korea because the system there is repressive. But if I don't, someone else may do. So that is another question that usually companies may address. And that is why it is quite difficult for companies to take decisions as to that point. Corruption is another subject matter that we need to discuss. Now, corruption here, government officials may ask for bribes for a multinational corporate to get things done. Now, for example, one of these things is the license. So a company cannot get the license to start operating business activities in a given country without paying briberies. Now, should company apply to this kind of demand by officials in these countries or not? Of course, this is an ethical dilemma, but some companies may justify doing so by having no other options but paying bribes. But this is still one of the ethical dilemmas that companies should deal with. So, is a multinational corporate's manager who agrees a corrupt manager? Now, this is a question. Of course, basically, yes. But again, as we discussed the justification arguments by some people, some of those people may say there is no alternative but to pay. But of course, this is still one of the ethical issues, and of course, is a corrupt manager. Should a multinational corporate ever agree to bribery demands? So this is another question. Some people may argue that according to the given circumstances, if there is or if the company is imposed and somehow enforced to do so, so they say it's a matter of exception. But of course, this kind of exception may result in harming other businesses or harming customers, environment. So accordingly, these bribery demands are actually wrong, and that managers should not agree. Now, regarding the power and the more decision, when we talk about multinational corporates, we may talk about business or huge businesses that have the power to affect countries' level of income, countries' economy. So they have huge power, and accordingly, they have more decisions to follow. So multinational companies have power of a host country. They can affect the whole economic system. They can affect the number of employees employed in these companies. So by doing so, they have power over this host country. So they can move production away. If they do so, the country may lose a lot of employees and the level of unemployment rate will increase. On the other hand, the level of the GDP or the economic status of the country may also drop as a result. So we're talking about very poor countries that can be afraid of such kind of practices by these companies. And that these companies will have huge power over these countries. So that is why we say power is morally neutral. It doesn't mean that power is not important, but what's important is that how this power is actually used. So how it is used is actually what matters. So perceptions of how it should be used and of its impact can be different. For example, a company may think of its power as a means of generating profit. This is the company view. While on the other hand, as we talk about the country where that company works, it can be totally different. So the power of this company should be used in providing more job opportunities, reducing the environmental problems, providing more opportunities for other businesses, and supporting industries to flourish and to start their own businesses. Now we talk about the social responsibility of these huge businesses. Now social responsibility is actually the decisions that should be made by these businesses as a consideration of social consequences of economic actions. I am operating in these countries, so what responsibilities do I have to this community? So a number of jobs, for example, providing a livable environment without affecting the environment, banning corruptional procedures by either individuals in the company or objecting any kind of illegal procedures made by some government officials that can affect other businesses or the customers. So that is why we have this noblesse oblige. Honorable and benevolent behavior is the responsibility of those in power. So why do managers behave sometimes unethically? This is going to be one of the main topics we would discuss in different sessions. Sometimes managers may have to deal or behave unethically for the following reasons. The societal culture itself, decision-making process, leadership style adopted, unrealistic performance goals, organizational culture, and personal ethics. So we would take about these one by one. For example here, personal ethics can be the reason why managers may behave unethically. For example, the generally accepted principles of right and wrong that the person have can be the result why he or she may act unethically. So for example here, expat violating their personal ethics. Expatriates here are the people working in another country. So for example, if we have Japanese employees of Toyota working in China, sometimes because of the culture and the differences of culture and the rules in China, they may violate their personal ethics. Managers sometimes relying on economic analysis when making decisions. This may by itself sounds good, but if we do not consider other issues, like, for example, the condition of the work, human rights, the rights of the individuals and the employees as well. So thinking only of economic analysis when taking decision without thinking about employees, customer, environment, relations, etc. will be, of course, wrong. So this is another reason why sometimes manager may behave unethically. So they only consider profit without considering other elements. Another reason why managers may behave unethically is the decision-making process. So the organization culture that does not emphasize business culture will definitely encourage unethical behavior. So the culture of the company that, for example, motivates innovation, employees will accordingly behave in that way. Organization culture, on the other hand, that motivates copying and selecting ideas of others, copying the ideas of the others, even patented, would develop such kind of poor practices by individuals. That is why this is an example of how individuals may be affected by the culture of the organization. So culture and decision process are ways that may develop such kind of unethical decision-making process. So the organization culture can legitimize unethical behavior. For example, individuals who can bring new ideas of businesses that are actually adopted by other businesses can be somehow appraised by the company itself. They can be even given some kind of rewards for stealing ideas of other businesses. So by doing so, this becomes something legal and accepted by the company, while in fact it is not legal in general. So that is why some companies may result in terms of operations with ethical or result in ethical dilemmas. Unrealistic performance expectations. If the company itself expects a 15% increase in sales, for example, so the manager would think only in obtaining and reaching this goal. If the goal increase, for example, or the objectives here are like 30%, this is very difficult to achieve. So we say this is unrealistic performance by managers. So they will do whatsoever means to achieve this rate without thinking of ethical issues. So that is why it's another reason why managers behave unethically. Leadership. We said here, leadership is affecting others' behavior, and accordingly, the employees will do the same as their leaders. So when leaders act unethically, their subordinates may act unethically too. Social culture, societal culture, firms located in individualistic culture with high uncertainty avoidance are more likely to stress ethical behavior than companies that are headquartered in cultures with masculinity and power distance rank high. So here we're talking about the culture dimensions. The culture can affect how managers act. So for example, in culture with high uncertainty avoidance, so managers are afraid of uncertain decisions. So they try to make the best decision because of such kind of fairness. So they usually stress ethical behavior because they have fear of the consequences of poor decisions. So that is why culture sometimes may affect a decision-making process. Now, how can managers make ethical decisions? On the other hand, we have discussed why managers behave unethically. Now, there are some steps on how managers may make ethical decisions. For example, they need to hire and promote people with well-grounded sense of personal ethics. They need to build an organization culture, the kind of culture that only places a high value on ethical behavior. They also need to make sure that leaders within businesses articulate the rhetoric stories of ethical behavior and accordingly act in a manner that is consistent with that rhetoric. So rhetoric can be a sense or a story that is somehow spreads among members in the organization and promotes ethical conduct. They also need to put decision-making process in place that require people to consider the ethical dimensions of business decisions. And now, students, we come to the end of the subject, and the session today we talked about is actually about the business ethics. We come up with a definition to the word ethics. How is ethic different from, or ethics different from morality as terms? So we discussed the following. We defined ethics and business ethics and its issues. We discussed the general business ethical issues that can be among the ethical dilemmas, day-to-day kind of business that companies have to deal with. And we also discussed the application of ethics to corporate organization. We evaluated the various arguments for and against business ethics. At the end of the subject, there is an assignment attached to this session where you have to deal with different questions. The main purpose of these questions is to test the students' comprehension, as I said before. And hopefully students can address these questions not in terms of memorizing, but of course of analyzing, applying the terms, trying to evaluate these kind of concepts in different business contexts. By this we come to the end. Thank you very much for listening. See you inshallah next week. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.